makes you think they're a bunch of vegetarian Vikings. I don't think that's very likely.
They would have a hard time living in Iceland if they were vegetarian.
Right. Welcome to Archaeology Books for Fun, digging books that aren't drier than dirt. I'm your host, Tristan Herrenstein, with me as always is my co-host, Barbara Clark.
Hello, everybody.
Today, we're very excited to start on the second episode of Archaeology from Space. This is going to be chapters 3 and 4. If you're following along, recommend you do. But yeah, this last time we kind of got an introduction to the author and some basic archaeology concepts. I feel like that continues, the basic archaeology concepts continue in these chapters.
I think so, because, the way it starts out is what makes the news in archaeology versus what most of archaeology is like, So
yeah, and then we also, of course, got a lot of talk about satellites and technology and how we use it in archaeology.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's talk about what makes the news.
Yeah, so, when you read archaeology and popular media, it's always like this great lost, in quotes, city's been discovered, or it's some gold dazzling object, right? Some specific artifact. And like, that's very, very cool and everything, but it's kind of not what archaeology is.
Kind of not real.
Yeah.
In a way.
And honestly, I think she does a good job talking about how, like, that's not even like the interesting stuff,
right.
Really. It's about the everyday people. And that's what's really neat about archaeology, is the ability to tell us what the commoner, was doing. Because we do know for a lot of times what the elites were doing and stuff. And
it's about the untold stories.
Yeah. So,
well, and that's the thing too, is like, in our area, the turpentine industry was a huge deal. And I've heard people say, oh, people don't want to hear about turpentine anymore. They're bored of that.
I have a cool lecture for you.
Yeah. And that's what it's all about, right? It's not that they're bored of it. It's that they need it presented in a way that they can relate to.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where the mundane archaeology, again in quotes, comes into play there.
Right. And I think she does a really good job of just discussing how, in a way, museum curators are almost missing the mark.
Yeah. It was interesting because I like, whoa, she's really throwing some shade at museum curators here. But then she explains kind of why.
Yeah.
And there definitely are cases of that.
Yeah. I think it was, I like this part because I feel like it reiterated a lot of what we've already discussed in past episodes and in past books. And it's nice to see it.
Someone saying it.
Yeah. And she's an archaeologist.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of times when we, like, Stealing History, it was a journalist writing the book, And so it's nice to hear someone who's within our profession saying, like, hey, guys, we need to do better, almost.
Right. Well, and yeah, so basically her example here, she saw a traveling exhibit about Pompeii and was upset that it was about 80% gold.
Yeah.
And I even had in there when at that point boring, because that's boring.
Well, and like all this stuff like that we've learned about Pompeii, like who cares about the gold? What about the frescoes and the art and all this stuff that these people created?
And the opportunities to learn about daily life that we don't have elsewhere. And she even says she observed visitors taking more interest in that kind of a thing. Because how much gold can you look at before it's just more gold?
And it's not relatable to a lot of us. Like if you look at utensils and things and tools, they're more relatable than gold.
And unfortunately, that sort of an exhibit really reinforces the idea that archaeologists are about treasure and things.
Which does us no favors.
It does us no favors. If you've listened to at least Stealing History, I know this has probably come up with Finders Keepers as well. One of the key, most tired arguments we get is that the looters are doing the same things we are.
And we're keeping all this stuff for ourselves.
And we just want it for ourselves.
Yeah.
And that's not it. And that's not it at all. And we don't, like we said, the treasure and stuff is boring. That's not what we want to be finding most of the time. We want the stories it tells us.
She does mention, that's what fills our classroom.
Yeah.
And that's what makes people think archaeology is cool. And that's what helps sometimes justify funding. So it has its place, but I think we need to strike a better balance.
I think that if we can be better at communicating what we are learning, then we don't need the flash.
Right.
And that's where public archaeology comes in, at least to some degree.
You need us, everybody.
You need us. Well, that's part of our mission, is to help people connect to this past and find it. And that's why we're doing this podcast.
Right. But she talks about how, archaeology has evolved over time, which I think is important.
Right.
And
Indiana Jones was pretty representative of archaeologists at a time.
But
and
not now.
But not for a long time now. Yes.
And I thought it was interesting too about how she talks about that, we're operating on some basic assumptions, and most of the sites that we do work on have pre-existing research or information, and we kind of build upon that. And I think that goes back to what I said last episode about how these sites and the fact and the information we learn from them and the studying of them is not stagnant. It's always building upon itself.
Yep.
Science is cool.
I liked, yes, and we use a scientific process, form hypotheses, and test the hypotheses. I was very interested in an exercise she has her students do where she gives them some random photo of an artifact, and then they are tasked with interpreting that artifact with what they know. And the point being is your interpretations are wildly off, or they're overly generalistic to the point they're useless.
Yeah, because you're coming up with a whole interpretation based on one object.
Without more context.
Right. And I do like how she mentions the ceremonial object. Some people just default to the...
Even students did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a joke in archaeology where if we don't know what it is, we just say, oh, it must be ceremonial.
Right.
As a joke, to make clear.
And while some people, at least in the past, have done that too much, I don't think it's very
that's how it
common
became a joke.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so I thought it was funny that some of her students who were like completely new to the field were like, it must be ceremonial.
Right. And then we get to how a dig works. And this is some interesting stuff here, because I feel like we're starting to see some signs here that her experience as an archaeologist is not the common experience.
Yeah, for sure.
And we'll talk about that some more, but we start with every dig risks reputation and life.
Right.
And I guess technically, but so does walking down the street in the same way. So
yeah. When I was doing shovel testing at 25-meter intervals, I was not looking for the next big discovery, and I didn't feel like my reputation.
And if this site is negative, then our career is ruined.
Right.
Negative data is still data, kind of a thing, right?
Yeah, we just move on to the next hole.
But if you're privately funded or grant funded and you're not getting results, I suppose maybe.
Yeah, it has like this weird kind of...
But it's talking about like this is the common experience, and it's
right.
not. Very much
Again,
not.
It comes off, like I said in the last episode, like very ivory tower, academia, elitist almost.
Yeah. And it says other countries with have complications with cultural and linguistic challenges. I said, heck, that can happen in your own country.
Yeah. Well, and when I was reading this chapter, I started to feel like she was going a little bit too hard on the trying to justify why archaeology is like this almost like self-sacrificing kind of...
maybe.
I don't know, like almost like I need to justify my job almost, it was weird to me.
Well, it's not about the big flashy things, and then there's a lot of talk about the big flashy things.
Well, and just like...
So the content isn't matching up with the words sometimes.
And even just the way she talks about field work and stuff, like, oh, it's dangerous and this and that. It's like
it can be, but it wasn't every time.
But like,
by long means.
Anybody who works outside, and most jobs have a level of danger to them, like construction work. I would rather be in the field any day of the week than be around like heavy machinery. I'm sorry. So it just has this kind of...
Well, there's an odd way that sometimes she seems to like present an idea and then never finish the idea. So she starts this chapter with every dig risks reputation and life, and then never talks about that.
Right. Yeah.
Like, you can't just introduce that idea and then drop it. You got to explain what that means.
Yeah.
Because now you've caught my attention, but then it doesn't pay off. And that was getting on my nerves a little bit sometimes. And then, so here's some more examples. Site supervisors are the start of the dig. And it's like, no, that's the crew.
Right.
The crew is the foundation of the dig.
Yeah.
But she means the crew is the workforce, and for her, the crew are the specialists, it seems like to me. Which, again, I've never been on a dig where we bring in like a specialist team.
Yeah, the only time I've had like a specialist is if we had like an architectural historian because we were doing a DOT project through like a historic district.
And
I've
had a soil specialist come in for like a day on a project, but not for the whole thing.
But I think that's the difference between like research, academic type.
And also probably Egyptology. She does have a very excellent field story about tackling a goat that was trying to steal their paperwork.
That was pretty funny.
Yep. She ended up tackling it and saving part of the paperwork. And then they were given a feast at the end of the project. And guess who's the main course?
Which is fair.
I guess the local folks thought it was pretty hilarious, which they good.
Yeah.
I actually have also experienced in Utah, in particular, there were dust devils so strong that they would rip paperwork off clipboards, and actually seen artifacts in paper bags go flying off sometimes. So yeah, that kind of thing is a pretty major hazard for the archaeology, not for life or limb.
In Florida, it was mostly like crazy out of the blue storms.
Yeah.
And you're just trying to get everything in somewhere where it won't get wet.
And then we move on to starting to talk about the Vikings.
Right.
And it's not immediately clear why. I think it becomes kind of okay at the moment, but there's not a real good segue into this. It didn't.
Yeah, because I was like, well, I thought she was an Egyptologist.
Right.
Now all of a sudden we're talking about Vikings. Okay.
Well, I did know because I remembered that we talked about this in Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries, that she did do some Viking work too. So I guess I had that context going in.
Oh, yeah.
So maybe it didn't hit me quite as hard. But yeah, basically we get a little bit of backstory on how the first Viking site in North America was uncovered by a very enthusiastic couple, and how looking for sites in Iceland in particular is difficult because they're looking for essentially turf longhouses.
Yeah, which they're so cool.
Very
when I was in
cool.
Iceland, when she talks about how she would spend a lot of time petting walls.
Yeah.
When I was in Iceland, we went to a couple places where they did have turf walls, and it's so cool. And she talks about the settlement exhibition in Reykjavik.
Mm-hmm.
That was one of the places I dragged my friend somewhat unwillingly to go check out, because I was like, we're here, we're going to see a Viking longhouse. Okay, we're doing this.
Yeah.
And we got to see some of the preserved documents and stuff. Very cool, very cool. But yeah, the turf, it's interesting because there aren't a lot of trees, right? They didn't have a lot of wood.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, they had to build everything out of turf, which...
I grew up in Nebraska where sod houses were a common thing, the same issue, not a lot of trees. So people built sod houses.
And they're everywhere. And they're really neat. It doesn't look anything like what I would have pictured. They make herringbone patterns with them and all sorts. Like, it's beautiful. Like, just cool. Very fanciest sod houses I've ever... not that I've come across a ton of them,
right.
but they are... They
famous Florida sod house.
Yeah, they set the standard high. I have a high expectation for sod houses now.
Then we move on to a project they're on where they're part of a BBC show.
Yeah.
Looking for Vikings in Iceland, I think, in this point.
Mm-hmm.
And they're using some satellite imagery. And there's some interesting details, like she noticed the imagery was skewed and realized, it's because it's on the slope of a volcano, and that slope skews the imagery.
Yeah.
And so they find a few places to check out. And this is where focusing less on the flashy stuff is represented in the book, because they're not looking for the longhouses per se. They can identify those okay. They're looking for the outbuildings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The barns, the sheds, because those are part of the whole farmhouse and part of that whole story, but they're much smaller and harder to find. And a quote from the book, we don't just have a small building, we have a story.
Well, I like how she talked too about how, like, the difficulty of finding these small foundations, because she's like, you have degraded ancient turf structures hidden in massive turf fields. That's a needle in a haystack made of needles.
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, that would be tough. And like, I think it's just fascinating how, based on what is in the ground, the vegetation can change. In satellite imagery, even just changes in vegetation can tell you where walls or structures might be.
I've actually seen that on the ground.
Yeah.
Out west in particular. I mean, we've seen it somewhat here, but
the
out west it really stands
so
out because
here.
It's so dry. If there's a little divot, there's often will be plants growing more green in that divot.
Nice. That's very cool.
It was very cool.
Well, and like, been to Iceland, and I remember as we're driving down the roads, you look out and it just looks like the same.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I cannot imagine doing like a ground, like a reconnaissance type survey, and really being able to see, first of all, walking. I mean, it's all volcanic, like rock and ash and stuff. Walking on it must be really difficult. But then I don't know that you would be able to really...
I bet you get more than you had in that moment, because you do develop...
Yeah. You develop an eye for what to
Yeah.
look for, but it would take that experience. But, somebody coming from out of the country, I feel like satellite imagery might be the best way to do it.
You really develop an eye for those things that would be invisible to most people.
Yeah.
Same with us and slumping of graves.
Oh, yeah.
Like, most people don't see them, but we kind of you step in a space, oh, here's probably something right here.
Oh yeah, even like as I drive, like if I'm on a road trip going along like Interstate 10, I'm like, I bet there's a site there. There's probably a site there. That looks like it might. Everybody's like, what do you see? And I'm like, it just looks like it would have a site. I can't tell you.
I do appreciate that she has some examples of her kind of not succeeding.
Right. Which is like most of archaeology.
Right. That is very genuine, especially when you're developing new tech and new methods like this. So she had a site where she was not thinking it was going to be much. And BBC decided, nope, we're going to do it anyway. And it turns out it was a huge site, like a huge garden, walled garden area.
And she says like it was humbling for her.
Yeah.
You know?
And then we moved to Rome. And so I think I understood a bit of what she was doing here more than I've had some issues with that in chapters like, what is the point of this? And the point of these is she is talking about things she's learned or things she's gotten wrong over the years. So she's demonstrating the struggle of the process and everything. And so she gets asked to do some satellite work for Rome area. And she's got a specific place where they're working. She's working with someone who's been there for a long time. And he's been looking for a specific amphitheater. And she says, first off the bat, she like loads it up and she does a bunch of work overnight and sends him the data. And he's like, yeah, we know about those.
Right. And so she's like, ooh.
I like, oh, okay, that would be kind of humiliating. But
she's like, well, I guess I missed a few of his publications.
Yep. But then she goes back and does some more work and ultimately just talk about an interesting concept that definitely is a thing that happens. We're going to pronounce it as pareidolia, perhaps.
Yeah.
Where we tend to see shapes, especially when you look at something for so long, you start seeing shapes and patterns and things that aren't there.
And we've dealt with this with people.
Well, that's a very human thing too.
Yep.
That's why we see a man in the moon, right? Or a rabbit in the moon, depending on culture. But our brains are geared to seeing those things.
That's why that cloud looks like a dog and that other cloud looks like a horse. And
we definitely have people bringing in stuff they think is something, and it's this whole phenomenon again.
It's a rock.
Right. And so in her case, she needs people with her to check her essentially. And that's very fair. So next she tries infrared. And so in this case, she's looking for variations in vegetation health. But turns up a large ovoid shape, and she's not very optimistic, but the local archaeologist is over the moon excited about it. And they haven't done any testing on it at this point of the book, but he seemed to think that was a very likely amphitheater site he was looking for, which, if anyone's going to know that, it would be him.
Yeah, she thought it was just like maybe possibly like a water cistern.
Right.
But she
Something
sent it
modern or more modern.
Yeah, sent it him, be like, hey, you know the area. What do you think? Kind of thing. I think she does do a really good job, especially in this chapter, of just talking about kind of staying in your lane and recognizing other people's specialization.
Actually, that's fair. Yeah.
Yeah.
That is a very good thing she's doing in this particular. She is acknowledging other people's specialty. And even though she has this cool new technique that she's doing, there's still a lot of value in their experience and their dedication. That's actually really good. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Chapter 4. This one, again, it started off a little confusing to me because we're starting about getting into archaeology. And we've talked about this. Some people are born and just love the thing. Some people come to it later. But she then says, who gets to call themselves an archaeologist? And this did not go the way I was expecting it to go.
Yeah.
But I thought it was going to be about the amateur archaeologists calling themselves an archaeologist, even though they have no training and, all that stuff. And that can have some problems. But that's not what we're talking about here. It's just simply who gets trained and then calls themselves an archaeologist.
But this whole thing was weird to me.
Yeah.
It didn't sit right. I can't really put into words why. It just seems like...
Well, it isn't representative of our experience.
Yeah. It's just...
So...
It was kind of triggering.
She says, in North America, archaeologists often start in anthropology, classics, or Near Eastern studies or art history. No, they don't.
Yeah.
They often start in anthropology.
Right.
They might occasionally come from those other disciplines. That's not how they often...
Most of the time, every archaeologist I've known is either started off in anthropology or started off in classics. And if they're in classics, they study classical archaeology from Rome, Greece, and they might cross over and do field schools together and stuff like that. But art history, I'm I don't know any archaeologists that comes from an art history background. That might be a Egypt thing. And it just was weird to I don't know. I just sometimes when she writes things like this, I'm it comes off as elitist, even if it's not meant to.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, it comes off as an Egyptologist.
Yeah.
And this is kind of emphasizing kind of some of our feelings on that in the first episode, perhaps.
Well, also weird was the way she was like, archaeology pays so little. We do it for the love and stuff. And then while that's true, like this is the problem I always have with our field is we have to get so much education, to be a supervisor, to be in a good position within archaeology, you have to have at least a master's degree. And then it's like we wear this, we're like this, we're sacrificing for the good of the cause. And it's like, that doesn't do us any favors.
No.
Like, we deserve a certain amount of respect. We deserve a certain amount of pay.
Yeah.
Because we have this degree that we worked really hard for. We do a job that should be valued by society, that contributes to our understanding of society and better society. Why are we like allowing this to continue by being like, we're sacrificing for the good of the cause? No, we need to be able to pay our bills.
Right. And we need to have a life outside of work, or work needs to pay us for not having a life outside of our work.
Like that whole
Well, to kick it off here, she describes the typical experience of someone getting into archaeology. To become a director, you started with volunteering for a few seasons.
Yeah.
No, you don't.
Right.
You might do a field school, which you could qualify as kind of that, but for a few seasons, who can afford that?
Right.
That's nonsense. That's why this is Egyptology.
Yeah.
This is not the standard experience, but she's talking like it is the standard experience.
Well, and it kind of made me mad because we're doing everything we can as archaeologists right now to make field school affordable.
Mm-hmm.
And professionals are pushing for better pay and better treatment. And it just rubbed me the wrong way. And I know this is Egyptology and not representative of archaeology in the United States. But like, I remember going to a meeting a couple years ago where there was even in Canada, they were talking about unionizing.
Yeah.
So like,
well, and what gets me a little bit too is we have to put a lot of effort into telling people, no, like, yes, okay, Egypt archaeology is cool, but there is cool archaeology everywhere. Even in your community, there is amazing, fascinating stories and things people are learning that are worth you knowing about. And to have this say that this is all archaeologists undermines a lot of that effort too.
Well, and then who gets to call themselves an archaeologist? Someone who is an archaeologist. Like another thing that sometimes bugs me is when somebody starts talking to me and they're like, oh yeah, I'm an archaeologist. And it turns out like they're just a looter.
Right.
They don't have any formal training and they're doing like detrimental things to the resource. So like this whole thing was just annoying to me because I feel like as archaeologists, we really need to move past that. We're sacrificing for the good of the cause. It's like, no, we have a degree. We are a professional. Let's act like it.
Yep. All right. We're off our soapbox for the moment. There is some more good stuff in here. I did like description of being on the crew and not being in charge and being able to say, oh, that's not my mess. I really appreciated that sometimes when I was on the crew.
Mm-hmm.
I also appreciated her observations on how incredibly different and stressful it is when you start leading a team.
Yeah.
And that is actually one of my major beefs with the training that we get is because a lot of us, especially in like the master's level programs, are training to probably be someone's boss.
Yeah. We don't have any business degree.
Well, they're not, and they don't introduce any training on how to manage people
and like manage a field budget.
That should be, this should be basic stuff in the trainings there.
Yep. And that's part of the reason why I went and got a second master's.
She did a good job of highlighting some of that. I appreciated it. Here's the thing. When she describes the crew, I thought, 10, 15 people, maybe. No, she has a core staff of 15, Egyptian professional digging team of 8, and a workforce of over 70, plus day labor, police, and guards. That's a whole town of people.
Well, like when she starts talking about like how her job is pretty much like coordinating meals and stuff, I had in my mind like camp stove, hello?
Yeah.
But then I was like, oh.
But when you're dealing with
like you
probably
need a caterer.
120 people,
yeah.
Holy cow, this is a different world than we've ever experienced before.
Well, and sometimes I feel like with my job as like regional director at FPAN, I'm like, man, I do a lot more administrative stuff than I do like archaeology related stuff. I won't complain anymore.
Yeah.
Like, I'm good. But then she like goes back and she's like, and you might be wondering why I was in Iceland or whatever.
Yeah.
Or, like,
Then we switch back.
Yeah, I was like, this is weird. Like that should have all been in the same chapter.
But the whole like building up your career and leading a team isn't really a part of this chapter.
Right.
It doesn't have any business being in this chapter. Interesting. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, we're back in Iceland. And now specifically, they're going to look for some more Viking sites in Newfoundland. They have the one that we know is there, but the question is, if there's one, there's probably more than one. That's how things usually go. And then how far did they go? How far north, how far south did they go? So they're going to use this data to try and find some sites. So she gets a team of a couple specialists together, which feels more in keeping of what I'd expect.
Yeah.
And actually really does.
Because I guess nobody had really ever done a systematic search for Viking sites in the North American Eastern Seaboard, especially with remote sensing. But really, honestly, there's been no systematic research of that type.
Yeah.
And I do like how, as she was talking about this, she was like, to get high resolution imagery for the entire Canada's eastern coastline would just be way too expensive. So we used Google Earth and Bing to kind of start with, which makes sense, right?
Yeah, that's how you do that. So that kind of tells you about how we navigate budget restrictions.
Yeah, so she kind of narrowed it down based on that. And then once she had a more reasonable figure, she went in and I think she narrowed it down to like 6 sites.
Something like that.
And then at some point 2, and then she's like, okay, now we can afford the fancy imagery.
Right. And so essentially just to recap for folks who don't know, the Vikings in North America, there are some things like the Kensington stones are referenced not by name in this, but these are supposed rune stones in Minnesota, which was covered very thoroughly in Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries chapter 6. So part 2, if you wanted to go check that out. And this is it's a fraud, basically. There's no question about it. They are not real, but there are some real sites, and there are some actual like kind of sagas that kind of function as records. In particular, there's one involving Eric the Red, who apparently got into some trouble in Iceland enough that they kicked him out, and he said, fine, I'm going to go find my own place to be.
I'm going to take my toys and leave.
And made several trips to what they refer to in the saga as Vinland. Now, we talked about this before, and I forget which book. It might have been Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries.
I think it was, yeah.
But my understanding was he got lost or got blown off course from a storm maybe and found it that way.
I think that's how he found Greenland. That's how he ended up in Greenland.
It could be.
I can't remember.
Because there was something about somebody buying the boat because the boat might remember the way or something.
Yeah, that was, And I know eventually he did settle Greenland.
Yeah.
That's where he ended up, like, long term.
So if you know someone who likes Vikings, and if it wasn't for the use of satellites and GPS, would probably end up discovering a new continent by accident, send them this episode. We think they'll like it. Here's an interesting little mistake, too. We get into the archaeological site we mentioned before, where people found Vikings, essentially.
Yeah.
We're in North America. We talked about this in Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries, but we also talked about this site in Hoofbeats, chapter 12, part 4.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting things, this is, again, where sometimes the phrasing really makes things unclear in this book. She says there were no animal bones. Right. Like, no, there were no domestic animal bones.
Right.
I went and checked those other sources, and they very clearly specified no domestic animal bones because they were hunting, they were fishing. Of course they were.
Which is indicative of they probably didn't stay there very long term, or
we don't know exactly why they didn't have any horses or anything with them.
Yeah,
and that's one of the interesting parts. But the phrasing is important there because the book is unspecific in that. It makes you think they were a bunch of vegetarian Vikings. I don't think that's very likely.
Yeah, not likely at all. They would have a hard time living in Iceland if they were vegetarian.
Right.
But one thing I did like about this is how, because I feel like we as archaeologists have all had this moment, maybe not to this extent, where, she was finding all this stuff and she thought she was on to something, right? She found what she thought was a wall. She found the bog iron, which she goes into, and we can discuss it if we want, but she thought like that it might be evidence of smelting, right? And she finds all this stuff and she's like, oh my gosh, I think we're on to something. And everybody gets really excited. And then it turns out like, oh no, wait.
Well, and it gets a little worse too, because they go and they do remote sensing first.
And then they do excavating.
And then they do testing for a season. And then that's when they find all this exciting stuff.
Yeah.
And then they organize a full crew
Yeah.
of all the specialists and stuff to go. And then it all falls apart.
Right. But I mean, that's science, right?
That is how it works.
Yep.
And it doesn't feel good, but she also does a good job of pointing out, and this is 100% true, the point wasn't explicitly to find a Viking site. The point was to test this technology in the area and to learn from it. And they did.
Yeah.
They learned that you can actually come across these features that can look deceptively like walls and turf walls. They learned that maybe somebody was gathering bog iron. I wonder if they just, were ringing their fire with it or something, and then it got cooked in that scenario. But
yeah. But I really did like that, because I feel like, earlier said, like, she mentioned, like, oh, your whole reputation can be staked on this one site or this one excavation or whatever. And I've not, like, it's science, right? You either do the thing or you don't. But with every step, even if, like you said, negative data is still data.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we can go into it as archaeologists or as any scientist thinking like, oh my gosh, if I don't find this thing, it's over, I'm ruined, blah, 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 because they're building blocks.
And you may not find it, but you may do the work that someone else needs to find it.
Right, exactly.
And that is just as valuable. We shouldn't seek out the big discoveries for ourselves. They're wonderful when they happen, but what we should be seeking is to contribute.
And I think the problem is, especially in her world where you're relying on grant funding and stuff like that.
And private funding, I think.
The private funding, the funding sources want that big flashy thing. And that doesn't happen on the regular.
You can't make that happen.
Right.
Well, you can, but then you're making it up.
Right.
And she's not doing that, to her credit.
Yeah, let's not do that.
Right.
So I think it's really important that our listeners just understand that when you are reading something in the news, or you hear something on social media and it might seem like a failure, or the scientists didn't do the thing the scientists set out to do, they're setting up the foundation so perhaps the next scientist can move forward. And so, like in this case, she used this technology for the first time in this area, and now they know a little bit more about how to utilize that technology, what to look for, and things like that.
Well, and they've seen how it can work, and they've seen maybe actually this is almost more useful maybe now they've seen some of the pitfalls of it.
Yeah.
Right? The turf wall-like anomaly was so rare, a guy who'd been working there for 30 years had never seen anything like it.
Yeah.
So that's not necessarily something common, but I bet you find a lot more looking at satellite imagery.
Yeah. Well, and she even says, like, with LiDAR and, with other technologies, it kind of gives her an idea of what other technologies might prove more useful in that area, or how you would read them.
Or cross-reference them.
Yeah. So I thought it was pretty cool. Pretty interesting.
Yeah. So once again, the site's not a failure for all the reasons we stated, but also what is going on there. It seems like there was probably some level of human activity, even if it's very short. It could have been Norse people showing up, forging a few nails to fix their boat, and then moving on. It could have been that quick. Or it could be a local indigenous group, a local Native American group doing, gathering that and actually cooking the bog iron for some reason, which is very interesting and new. We haven't seen that before. Right. So even though it's not what we wanted, there's still interesting questions that come from that, even on just the archaeology level, let alone the technology level.
Yep. I like this chapter. Well, I guess I like the Viking part of this chapter.
Yeah. One thing I found interesting was when they're testing on the site, and maybe it's lacking context here, but they said it was, hold on. Okay. Yes. It was very, very wet. And when they went back, it was all dry.
Oh, yeah.
And so before there was so much water seeping into the unit that they had to bail it out several times a day. And she specifically says, which is about as destructive process as archaeology can experience. And again, with the vague phrasing, because the way she says it makes it sound like bailing out water is the most destructive process. She has to mean the inundation with water.
I would think so. And even then, like, how destructive it is depends upon like what type of soil it is and how fast it's being inundated.
It can dramatically affect how effective you are in your recording and your careful excavation, I think.
Yeah.
Maybe. But there's no way that bailing out water is the most destructive process.
No.
So it was very odd. I had to I couldn't quite figure out, unless I was missing something there. I remember also in Iceland, they could date things by the volcanic eruptions.
Yeah, like do like tree ring dating, but with
kind
soil.
of. And I was a little surprised that she didn't use that metaphor to explain it. But yeah, so essentially they can count the eruptions and then figure out when something happened. And it's probably a relatively narrow window between eruptions and stuff. That's fascinating.
I feel like Iceland always has something erupting
Yeah,
too. So.
it's true.
And yeah, that was one of the things that struck me so much when I visited there is just like in my mind, I started to think of Iceland as just like a giant pumice stone because like you would look out and there would just be like jagged black rock with this moss on it, like everywhere. And you're like, oh my gosh, so different. Very cool.
So Barbara, how many seasons did you volunteer before you got into archaeology?
0. I don't volunteer. Sorry.
I mean, you did a field school probably, right?
I did a field school, but like that was like cool.
Yeah.
Like I don't necessarily think of that as volunteering. Like
I wonder if there's a little discrepancy between, again, with Egyptologists. Again, I've always heard when I was starting off that if you want to do overseas archaeology, you're going to have to pay to do it.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's a little bit what's going on here.
Maybe. Yeah.
And I heard that. I was like, oh, I don't need to do it that badly.
Yeah, like, I'm sorry.
Maybe
I need to pay my
someday,
bills.
but I'd rather just visit. So
Right. I need to pay my bills.
Yeah.
I want to retire eventually.
Right. So one of the complaints I saw in a couple reviews for this is it doesn't talk enough about the satellites. How are you feeling about that?
So, and this might be my bias just because we work in archaeology and I have used like aerial photography and things like that before. And we've done, magnetometer surveys. And I was hoping to get some exposure to technology that I might not be as familiar with. But I feel like so far, I'm like, well, yeah, duh.
That's kind of not who she's writing for, I think.
I know. Yeah. And that's what I'm saying is like, I feel like I have a little bit of inherent bias just because I am an archaeologist. I feel like if I wasn't an archaeologist, I'd be like, oh, LiDAR, that's cool. I kind of heard of that. Or, oh, magnetometry, that's what that is,
I think I was expecting a little bit more about using the satellites. Maybe we'll get to that yet, too.
Yeah, we're still early. We just finished chapter 4.
We're only halfway. No, not halfway. Not even halfway.
Yeah.
We might get to that yet, but I found myself wanting it to be more about the satellite research, but also then I was like, but how would I actually write a book about that?
Yeah, that's my thing.
I looked at a picture for 10 hours today. I was like, how do you make a narrative out of that necessarily? You might be able to, but it wouldn't be easy.
But I feel like this last story about the Viking settlement in Newfoundland, I feel like that was the closest to what I was expecting.
That is about you're right. That is about the best what I was hoping for.
Because like we used the satellite imagery. This is how we used it. This is what it told us. And then we ground truth it. And this is what we found. Yeah.
And we use other technology too, magnetometer.
Yeah.
What else did they use?
Well, she says she wants to use LiDAR, but as far as we've read thus far, they haven't.
Right.
But that's what I expected more of.
Yeah.
But like you said, we're early.
We'll see how this goes.
Yeah.
And so we'll see how that goes next time. We'll be reading chapters 5 through 7. We'll see you all then.
Happy reading, everybody.